So I'm very glad you brought up Tibet again because I wanted to ask you something. Because last time when we are out in a bar and you talked to me about Tibetan language and how like we didn't have any spaces. If we want to find a word, we had to just read all of the read everything that's in the page and then and then we would find the word. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the actual the structure of the Tibetan
Yeah.
writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just lines of text. You open a Tibetan page
Yeah.
or Tibetan book, it's just lines of text.
Yeah. Exactly.
Nothing will pop out at you.
Yeah.
Just kikus and shamjus and talks, and then
Exactly.
you have to actually look for
Yeah.
and then be like, oh, that's a word, right? Those are little few limitations I saw. Yeah.
Because
So keep going. Yeah.
yeah, I was saying that Tibetan language is very difficult, and it's not just for us. I think it's from a linguistic standpoint as well. It's very difficult. I've heard some. I've from the research I have done by watching a lot of YouTube videos. I'll say that like people, yeah, about Tibetan language, about like they talk about like Tibetan language being very difficult because of the way things are spelled, and because that comes from Sanskrit. And what do you think? Do you think like it would be better if Tibetan language sort of like this is the good time for Tibetan language to evolve? I guess I know you're not an expert, but I think your opinion would be like really good, like because I think this is an important discussion that we might want
as
to
a
have.
consumer
Yeah,
of
as a
Tibetan
Tibetan,
language.
yeah, exactly. Because
Yeah.
because there are not a lot of people who are consuming Tibetan language, and I think Tibetan language needs to move forward in some way.
I don't consume it as much, I guess,
Exactly.
as
I don't know who consumes Tibetan language on a daily basis.
I don't think anyone.
I don't know if
Grandmother who watches.
folks in my family do. I mean, they read texts, the religious texts, but I don't think that's consumption. That's just
Yeah,
recitation.
yeah, recitation.
I think recitation is different from consumption because it's like looking at food versus eating it. And I think Tibetan language, there's a lot of recitation
Yeah.
culturally in our communities. But I think actual consumption is very rare. Like
Yeah.
you never meet, like, when was the last time someone gave you like a little Tibetan book and said like, hey, check this out, I love this author. Like, do you remember, has that ever happened to you? And I don't, not only to me, but I haven't seen other Tibetans interacting in this way. Like who is like a famous Tibetan author that's well known and like young and tackling a lot of critical subjects.
Yeah.
I'm not saying they don't exist. They exist, but it's not at a mass media level. It's not at a consumption level that it should be in order for it to go forward and continue to survive through the next few generations. And we need to come up with a way to do that. We need to find a way to make it more consumable, less what do you call it?
Yeah.
Less constricted.
Yeah.
Because right now, like, I think most Tibetans who are actually consuming and actually doing a lot of work on this are like scholars or specialists, specialist scholars, monastic communities, they consume it, and then they there's a small community maybe that writes a lot and only writes in Tibetan online and whatever, which is great. But that's not the norm, and it should be the norm. Exactly. Like you look at communities like the Korean communities in the West, they consume and still normalize on a regular basis their language. One of the
community, look at them, and they are always like in New York, like Chinese are Chinese people. They don't speak English.
I mean, yeah, you have to. I mean, obviously, you should speak, the language to help you wherever you are. But like one time we had a meeting with a very renowned Tibetan what do you call it? We had a meeting with a renowned Tibetan religious leader who was still in Tibet. I mean, who was in Tibet, and he had visited Western kind of Tibetan communities, and he said like, why isn't there as much Tibetan writing? Like, I see all these businesses and whatever, and it's all in English. Like, you know, you go to Chinatown, you see a lot of signs in Chinese. You go anywhere, Koreatown, Japanese town, you see their own language, right? Why isn't Tibetan writing as big, you know, as vivid, you know? And that points to it. You know, we have not normalized its consumption. We it's become such a little, you know, restricted thing that we have to change. We have to change our the way that we interact with it. And it has to be, like, I think, systemic. It can't be just like, oh, you know, like, you know, think about preserving the culture, you know, parents and children, think about, you know, language. And that's nice. And you know, maybe some people will, like a small percentage will work hard to teach, you know, Tibetan language, but that's not a working system. You actually need a working system. You need to create some environment for which Tibetan language learning is useful, you know. Like, young Tibetans have to find it useful. You can't just be like, oh, you know, think about your fatherland or your motherland, you know. That's not enough. It's more work. Like, you imagine, like, as a kid going to school from Monday to Friday, and then Sunday you have to go to Tibetan class. Like, how boring is that? You know, other kids are just playing, you know. Saturday and Sunday they have it off, and then you have Saturday and then Sunday you have to go to Tibetan class. As enjoyable as you make it, it doesn't matter, right? You're still making something more of a burden. It shouldn't be. Language should, you know, be more flexible. It shouldn't be a burden. It shouldn't be a requirement. It should be something that they engage with love, you know. And I think that's how it should be. Yeah, we have a lot of problems to tackle.
Yeah, you brought up a very important point. And just an interesting fact, Tibetan language hasn't changed since 8th century. I heard this, I was doing some research, and I don't know where I found it, but it hasn't changed since 8th century. And English language if you read English language from like 8th century, I know they're different languages, but still I wanted to point out the evolution. If you read this, there's this old English text, which is and it is an epic. It's called Beowulf, and I know this because I studied English literature a little bit. And then you can't read that text and understand, if you know English, you can't understand what's written in that story, because English language has changed so dramatically that you can't make it out anymore. And I just wanted to say that because I wanted to point out the evolution that languages do make, because during that time Latin turned into Spanish, French, and what else is there? I think Romani, I guess. So, but Tibetan language hasn't changed since then. Although although it originated really early, around 6th or 7th century, it still hasn't changed much. And I think it may be about time to think about, you know, like trying to, I don't want to say change, but yeah, as you said, you know, like trying to, it's time for it to evolve into something.
Adapt and evolve.
Yeah, because if it doesn't, it'll disappear within a couple generations, and no one will be able to speak Tibetan. It'll be like just another language that's lost in time.
Yeah, and it
as much as it's nice that people are taking individual efforts, I think there has to be a mass movement for the language. You know, it's not enough to have individual, like, you know,
because
efforts.
Yeah, because as a Tibetan, I love being Tibetan, and I love its culture, and I love its language. But sometimes we have to meet halfway. We just can't go all the way, because we have to live our lives as well. Because we are in America. We have to work every day. We have to go to school. We have to go to, just like you said, children have to go to school, and then you have to go on Sunday to study Tibetan class.
And you know, I'm what do you call it? I'm critical of those kinds of classes because I don't know if they last. I've known kids. I've seen kids grow up from being like 10 to like 20 in their 20s, you know. And I've seen them, and they haven't maintained good what do you call use of the language, you know. I'm sorry to say, it's not 100% effective system. I think it's good. to engage them in that way, to get them to know, fellow Tibetan youth. But we need a more effective way of doing this. And one of the ways that I feel actually is much more effective is immersion. When you actually send a kid who's in their, what do you call those ages? Their formative years. And
3 to like 8 or 9, right?
Maybe 3 is a bit young. Maybe like, let's say early teens. Early teens to like mid-teens. They're still learning a lot. They're still able to adapt, and normalize things. Immersion. I've heard, you probably heard of these too. Like kids being sent from the West to India or settlements, or in TCV or Tibetan classes. They stay like maybe half a year or a year or so, and they have no choice but to adapt. And these kids pick up the language so fast because they have to. They have no choice. And I think those are much more effective ways of really getting people to learn the language than like like once a week learning with. It's I don't know if
I think that's a very good point. I do have,
but even still, I mean, those are nice, but even still, I think our larger community around the world needs to come up with ways of really making the language more accessible, flexible, sexy, making it relevant. Like we have these rappers now who rap in Tibetan, right?
I think that's,
and they're making it cool to recite these Tibetan raps.
Do you know of them?
Shapale, I've heard Shapale. I was a huge fan. I'm a huge fan.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Shabale, Daosono, and then there's now people like Sunyi, and then like even from Tibet, there's groups like Ringluk who are creating a new angle of embracing their language, and it's amazing because young people want to sing those songs. Like I mean, I want to mention that female Tibetan rapper too, right?
Go ahead.
Freddie, what's her name? Okay, I will mention it. Yeah. What?
So I was saying subscribe.
Wait, let me Google this. I can't believe that it just passed my.
Look for her. It's okay.
Passed my Tibetan female rapper. What's her name?
Oh man.
What? Oh yeah, it says your internet connection is unstable, so it's probably Seldon. Yeah, Tenzin Seldon.
Tenzin Seldon. Subscribe.
Yeah, Seldon. Her raps are really cool, and a lot of young, boys and girls rapped along to her, right? We have to support and make it viable for them to live off of this, because they're creating more literature. They're creating more accessible literature. They're embracing and making people embrace, especially the young people, embrace the language. That's where we need to go. We don't need to recite as much. Yeah. We need to actually get people to actually understand what they're singing along to.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Since you said literature, I think people need to write in Tibetan, and I think people need to. Shakespeare brought up a lot of words in English language, and I think Tibetan could use some.
Yeah. I remember, I feel like an old man talking about his experiences and memories, but I remember one time I was on the street as SFT in Canada. I was canvassing. Canvassing is basically, standing in the street and asking people to sign petitions or asking them to join membership with the organization. And one older lady from Poland, an older Polish lady, came up to me and she's like, I really support your cause. She's like, the Tibetans, you're fighting a righteous cause. And she said, we the Polish, we suffered, I think she said more than 100 years or so under occupation. Yeah. And, we had a difficult time. But one thing, that really brought us back once we, were able to get our independence was our language, because we had a language, we were able to hold on to that identity. And she said, never lose your language, and that was such a moment for me. Like, it's like, it's true, language is such an important part of our identity that, it is rich. And there's all these myths in our history that we can access with our language. And there's truths, and those make us a distinct, people, as a distinct community.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.